Hello. You're here because you're wondering about Focus on the Family's multi-day Hope Restored marriage intensives. Are their results really miraculous? That's the message that their president, Jim Daly, gives, and that's what their massive online marketing suggests. But there are two problems with that claim. Number one, people who've attended say, no, it didn't fix their marriage. And I'll give you three first-person stories. And number two, Hope Restored admits that they are not the best choice if there's substance addiction, physical or emotional abuse, or adultery or an emotional affair. They actually tell you, you may want to go elsewhere. Well, abuse, infidelity, and addictions are among the worst problems a marriage can face. 1 in 4 highly religious couples admit they've experienced abuse in their current relationship. But there you are. Despite the many miracle claims, their own website lets you know that Hope Restored may not be your solution. For years, I've listened to past participants of these marriage intensives tell me what happened afterwards. In some cases, things were okay for 90 days, and then they got even worse than before. Eventually, the invested spouse decided to divorce to save their life and sanity. I've spoken out publicly on Focus on the Family's Facebook page about these problems, but they've deleted my comments and finally blocked me. They don't want to hear the issues that the participants bring up. If you're new to my channel, let me tell you a little bit about me. My name is Gretchen Baskerville. I'm a Christian. I've been leading divorce recovery groups in conservative churches since 1998. I've donated thousands of dollars to Focus on the Family. I've listened to their broadcasts since the 1980s. I've subscribed to their magazines. I've bought their books, but they have lost my trust. Imagine that your spouse treats you meanly, sometimes belittling you, criticizing you, mocking your opinions, indifferent to you, cheating on you, chronically lying, or even hitting you or the kids. Imagine that you hear about a $6,000 marriage intensive. You are so desperate. You're willing to spend more than a month's rent to go. But is it really worth tapping into your retirement? Does it really work? The president of Focus on the Family, Jim Daly, says the results are miraculous. But are they? Let me give you some exact quotes right from their website. Jim says, think of it like an emergency room for couples. Husbands and wives come in with a marriage that's hurting and on life support. But by the grace of God, and thanks to the proven marriage intensive model, by the way, they never proved this marriage intensive model is any better than any other Christian model, but that doesn't stop them from making this claim. It goes on to say that the counselors are able to stop the bleeding and stabilize the couple. The results are nothing less than a miracle. Okay, here's another claim from the Hope Restored site. Meet some of the thousands of real couples who thought their marriage was beyond repair, but experienced a miracle through a Hope Restored intensive. Watch a miracle unfold. So miracle is a big word for them. Here's another one. No matter what struggles you and your spouse face or how deep your pain goes, God heals broken hearts and can restore what seems lost. Are you open to God working a miracle in your marriage? Now, I've been doing divorce recovery in conservative churches for 25 years. I've never met a devout Christian who didn't give it their all to fix that marriage. They prayed, they fasted, they begged God for a miracle. They suffered for years. They read all the Focus on the Family books and turned themselves inside out to follow the instructions. They sacrificed their dignity and well-being to try to improve the marriage and to set a good example for their spouse. Finally, in many cases, there was a shattering event, and they realized they just had to leave to save themselves and their children. I'm going to share 3 first-person stories from people who attended Hope Restored and were open to a miracle. They liked the communication tools they learned, but they felt it did not solve the problem. They felt that the promises Hope Restored made about getting a great marriage were overblown. They would have been happy with merely a safe and respectful marriage, but they didn't even get that. The team at Hope Restored seems to have a distorted view that as long as you have faith in miracles, 3 to 5 days of counseling, and a few communication tools, the marriage will be great. And in my opinion, this is really naive, or maybe it's willful blindness. Hope Restored is promoted as the emergency room for desperate marriages. The president of Focus on the Family, Jim Daly, calls Hope Restored Marriage ER, and ER means emergency room. In other words, he's saying this is a program for marriages that need emergency intervention. Now, the average person knows that Jim isn't talking about marriages that need a few more communication skills or problem-solving techniques or conflict resolution strategies. These are really bad marriages, ones that are destructive or dangerous, not merely disappointing. Now, it would be reasonable to assume that anyone willing to pay $6,000 is desperate. There might be child abuse, violence, serial adultery, property damage, coercion, threats, criminal behavior, maybe even pedophilia, and family-destroying addictions, or extreme indifference and neglect. Yet here's what Jim Daly says: our marriage-intensive programs are like marriage ER. We hear many testimonies from couples whose relationships were literally on the ropes. They were headed for divorce court. But at that moment of crisis, our team at Focus on the Family was able to help them turn things around and start down the road to healing and restoration. What Jim doesn't bring up is that there are far worse things in life than divorce. For example, there's suicide, homicide, domestic violence, and child molesting. Harvard University published a study that found that when the new divorce laws were passed in the 1970s and the crime rates were compared about 10 years later, the suicide rates of wives dropped 8 to 16%. The domestic violence rate by and against men and women dropped 30%, and the homicide rate where the wife was the victim decreased 10%. Divorce saves lives. And that's what this article that Harvard University published found. Note how Jim Daly defines an emergency. It's a marriage that's headed to divorce, a marriage that might end legally. I think most reasonable people would define emergency a little bit differently. They would define domestic violence as an emergency. They would define a cheating husband or wife as an emergency. They would consider a child abusing parent to be an emergency. Is this just poor wording choice, or is this genuinely Focus on the Family's view that the goal is to avoid divorce, not to fix the marriage and make it safe? They appear to value one thing above all else: to keep your marriage legally intact. The Hope Restored website then asks, are you open to God working a miracle in your marriage? Doesn't that seem a little bit like strange wording? But here's what they say in their videos.
Do you believe that God can do a miracle? Are you open to a miracle? And if they answer yes, then they're a good candidate.
Are you open? Makes it sound as if you're not open, even though you've been begging the Lord to do a miracle for years. The word suggests that if you're having doubts that your marriage can be fixed, then there's something wrong with you and your faith, when in reality, you are seeing the tragic results of being in a long-term destructive marriage. And you know that if you stay much longer, your children won't have an emotionally healthy parent to lean on. I believe that Hope Restored is unsafe for many of the participants they accept into the program. And by the way, I just looked this morning on the homepage of Hope Restored, they still claim to be able to address infidelity. So let's get to the firsthand stories. Here's the first one. This is a woman who had so much hope for a miracle that she attended 3 of these marriage intensives, all under the same leadership that exists today. But the last one was after Focus on the Family took over the program. So let me give you her quote. We did 3 week-long intensives. The first week-long intensive was court-ordered. We went right after our 2-year restraining order expired. He had tried to kill me. So an off-duty police officer had to guard my door at night while we were there. I hadn't seen or talked to my husband other than in court for 2 years. Boy, did he put on an act for the staff. The therapist loved my husband. They encouraged me to get back together with him, told me it was safe. They pretended to be experts, but they don't know anything about how to get abusive men to stop abusing. They prohibited me from talking about the abuse we were enduring. Sure, they had some tools that helped me. Nonetheless, through talks with the founders of the program, I came to understand that every intensive and every marriage getaway weekend is always a manipulative stunt to make the organization more money. They are not interested in learning how to protect and help those who come to them who are being abused. That's her opinion. She went 3 times. Here's her video interview about her 3rd marriage intensive at the same location in Branson, Missouri, under the same leader, Robert Paul, which is now owned by Focus on the Family. I'm just going to play 5 minutes of the interview we did a couple years ago.
Via the phone with them. And I was constantly trying to say, I don't know what to do. These things are still, this abuse is still happening. And let me just say, in the first 2 intensives, abuse was never, ever worked on or brought up by any.
Wait. You never, they didn't even use the word abuse in the first 2 intensives you went to?
Or, I mean, not even the concept, not even the facts that that he abused me, left me for dead.
So what were they doing for 5 days for $5,000 or $6,000?
Well, they do what they do. They go through their program, doing their thing, and they just hope that it makes a difference, in people's lives. Well, abusive people don't stop abusing simply because you give them tools. The tools he further used to, and wielded against me, they were more hoops I had to jump through and get perfectly correct. And if I didn't, I was disrespecting him. And if I didn't perfectly teach them to my children and they perfectly carry them out, then he was free to abuse them as well.
Wow.
And I have heard this. There's not a lot of other people that I know that have been to these same intensives, but some, including the people we were there with. And each of them had the same, or similar, their husbands didn't get better either. But at the 3rd one that we went to, which was it was not with other couples. So it was just with 2 counselors, therapists, whatever they call them, and ourselves. That was supposed to be then more intensive. And they felt like that's, if we really were going to get help, that's what we needed. And I had sent to them that he had tried to kill my son. And there was ongoing, and even the pastor of the church I went to had sent letters confirming the abuse of the children and I. Okay, so they were fully aware, even at the 3rd one, of what was going on. And even my husband himself said when we went in, she's making me come to this because I did this. Okay? He himself said it to them. So I'll just fast forward to the last 15 minutes. I mean, I could tell you that whole week. I kept wondering, why are we here? Because they've never, ever addressed that big, huge, not just elephant, but herd of elephants that we live with, you know? And I had told him I was leaving him and taking the children. And I knew if it didn't go well, I was not going to make it home alive.
Hmm.
And I had told them that. I was certain. Because of the intenseness, again, of his violence. And, trying to kill his own son. Our own son. We get to the last 15 minutes. And my really trying to be submissive, obedient, quiet-spoken Christian woman self started screaming. I started screaming. You've never, in these 3 intensives, ever dealt with the elephants in the room. Ever. And here we are. We have 15 minutes left, and you have not dealt with the elephants, with the abuse that he is doing to my children and I. So much so that I am in full-blown panic. That's what I'm telling them right now, because I have to get in the car and drive 2 days home with him. Sorry, I'm yelling. I was really yelling, which is huge because I never yelled. It's, that's okay. First of all, wasn't really me, but I would certainly not yell in front of him, let alone therapist. But I mean, can you feel it? Can you feel how, anyway?
Yeah, no, I mean, I get it. I believe you loud and clear.
They took a break. I mean, they didn't know what to do. And they came back. We had 5 minutes left. And he says, the lead therapist, who had been the lead therapist through every time, said, okay, we're going to deal with the elephant. And you know what he said? He said to my husband, I forbid you, or you forbid us from talking about spiritual things. But we're going to address why you're not a Christian.
What?
That's what he said. And in the last 5 minutes, last 2 minutes, my husband's eyes, again, we had this magical moment of God coming in and doing this miracle of the scales came off his eyes. He got down on his knees and wept and confessed everything he'd done to me, the children, even other people in front of the counselors. And then we left.
Focus on the Family sent her home with him. He beat her many, many times. After another year, she finally divorced. She and her children are happier today, and she knows that God loves her and approves of her divorce. Well, that's pretty straightforward and very sobering. Here's testimony number 2 from a woman who asked me not to use her name. She said, when you arrive at the Michigan retreat, they give you a book that says certain kinds of situations will not change. My husband's serial infidelity was one of them. I wish they had been up front, but they took our money anyway. At least 3 of the 5 couples in our program were in seriously destructive marriages, and I stayed in touch with them. They haven't seen a miraculous change. We did have good leaders, and she mentions one of the therapists by name, and I thought he did an excellent job, but our marriage was at a level they couldn't fix. I did feel safe and comfortable, and they did mention the possibility of divorce, but bottom line, the program is not what they advertise. In front of the Hope Restored staff, my husband would admit his fault, but behind closed doors, it was all my fault, and he continued his affairs. I don't think my hope was restored, and I told the staff that. My pastor and my family supported my decision to file for divorce. Number one, your safety appears to be less important to Hope Restored than simply avoiding divorce. In their advertising, they state that impending divorce is the crisis they seek to solve. It appears that your safety is not their number one priority. And that becomes clear when you realize Focus on the Family's official statement does not condone divorce for physical violence or emotional abuse. Let me say that again. Focus on the Family's official policy does not condone divorce for physical violence or emotional abuse. They don't like to talk about the fact that their own doctrinal position endangers abuse victims and their children. Did you know that Jim Daly himself wants to overturn current divorce laws, which will make it harder for abuse victims to get to safety? See the show notes for the link. Number two, Hope Restored's ethics in advertising are a problem. They use the word miracle and miraculous in their advertising. They also play on people's fears of divorce and use spiritual manipulation, suggesting that you don't have enough faith if you aren't open to God doing a miracle through their program. They have just shifted the responsibility for the success of this program from their staff to you. Abuse victims hear the message. If you don't experience the miracle, it's because you didn't have enough faith and you didn't try hard enough. This is devastating. They leverage people's distress against them because their own doctrinal statement does not condone divorce for physical or emotional abuse, suggesting that the only option an abuse victim has is more counseling and more reconciling, the endless hamster wheel. You can never achieve the highest level of legal safety, which is getting a divorce. Jim Daly twists scriptures when he misquotes Malachi 2:16, saying that God hates divorce in every case. But that's not what the Bible says. It's not what Jesus said. But an abuse or infidelity victim may conclude that they are trapped for life and that Hope Restored is their only option, because anyone who chooses to divorce deserves God's hatred. This actually, in my opinion, violates the American Association of Christian Counseling Code of Ethics, paragraph 1820, in three ways. Let's look at the three ways. Number one, sensational or exaggerated claims. Yeah, claiming that they can do a miracle for $6,000 is absolutely sensational and exaggerated. Number two, exploiting fears and distress. Yep, they are exploiting your fear of going to divorce court. Number three, expressing unique or unusual helping abilities, such as hinting at their ability to do miracles and mentioning miracles frequently on their many web pages. Number three, serving two masters. Donors to Focus on the Family may give money because they want divorces stopped, but their clients want to be safe. Focus on the Family has run ads to attract donors who wish to stop divorce. Hope Restored's billionaire donor has challenged the leadership team at Hope Restored to make a dent in the country's divorce rate. And while that may sound good to some people, I wonder if he has ever listened for an hour to a battered wife. I would say that Hope Restored has an ethical problem. You can't serve two masters, money and safety. Look at my show notes for the sources. Now, I want to show you an advertisement that Focus on the Family ran. This long, narrow banner ad was inviting donors who want to stop divorce to donate to them. They wanted $30. If you notice, it says, broken couples need your help. Stop divorce. Just $30 can save a marriage from divorce. And you see a couple, their backs are turned slightly to each other. But we don't know. Maybe this couple is just having a spat. But what if it's actually something big? What if it's a violently, physically abusive marriage? In that case, maybe it would be safer for them to divorce. So I created this meme, kind of as a parody, saying your $30 donation to Focus on the Family will endanger one Christian domestic violence victim. Tell Focus no, because divorce saves lives of abuse victims and their children. Focus on the Family took down that ad really fast. Number 4, there's no scientifically validated proof of Hope Restored success claims. And this really bothers me. Hope Restored offers zero third-party evidence that these desperate couples are miraculously fixed in 5 days. They just want us to take their word for it. Now, in my mind, making these kinds of claims is completely unethical. At least it seems that way, based on my reading of the AACC Ethics Code. They're supposed to use accepted research standards in all research activities, which would include post-counseling surveys. The research needs to be ethical, ethically planned, and competently conducted. And they're supposed to honor formal requests for the original data so that the study can be replicated by another researcher. So if you're an academic researcher out there, you ought to be able to go to Focus on the Family and make a formal request for their original data so that you can see if you come up with the same numbers they do. Number 5, Hope Restored's own surveys claim they failed to achieve a miracle in at least 1 in 5 marriages within the first 2 years. When Hope Restores brags about its success, it's usually about how many marriages are still together 2 years later. Now, remember that a lot of divorces, especially where there's abuse or other very serious problems, take more than 2 years to finalize. Mine took 4 years. The 80% claim is interesting because if you look back 3 years before that, at Jim Daly's 2016 claim, he said that nearly 85% of marriages were saved from divorce. So they've changed their own figures, and I appreciate that they did that. But let me ask you this. Do you want to spend $6,000 so that you don't divorce for the next 2 years? Or do you want a safe, loving, respectful spouse who now has integrity and reliability? Number 6, Hope Restored cannot back up the claims because they don't use scientific survey methods, according to the participants who told me about the questionnaires they filled out after the intensive. A while back, Hope Restored made a brand new claim on their website that marital satisfaction had significantly increased. When I saw the claim about improved marital satisfaction, I was curious. I had never seen them make this claim before. Usually they only talk about how many people are still married 2 years later. Surely they must have had a new survey done. If so, I'd love to know the specifics. Who conducted the survey? Did it meet scientific standards? What were the questions? How were they asked? How many people did the survey? Was it the entire group of prior attendees? And if not, why not? And if so, how many years did they go back? And how many couples did not respond at all? These are important questions, and it's important to know because I have hundreds of people in my 5,000 member private online group who said they attended 1 or more multi-day Christian marriage intensives or retreats, such as Hope Restored or Weekend to Remember, and those marriage intensives didn't fix anything, at least not for more than about 90 days. Any miracle was short-lived. In the end, many of them had marriages so desperate, they needed a life-saving divorce to protect their life and sanity because their spouse didn't become safer. One woman wrote to me and told me about the Hope Restored survey she received. Now, her husband had cheated on her after the Hope Restored Marriage Intensive. I've edited this slightly to conceal her identity. She says that the follow-up survey did not even offer answers that fit her situation. So here's her quote. Yes, we attended Hope Restored in the fall of 2021, just a month after I discovered my husband's ongoing infidelity. 4 out of the 5 couples in our group were there because of infidelity. The counselors never addressed sin. They never spoke to my husband of his complete and total lack of remorse and repentance. I sat there in trauma the whole time, weeping. I hoped that if he could get beyond the shame, that we could restore our marriage. At the 1-year anniversary of our intensive, I received the survey from Focus on the Family. It was so skewed toward the positive that there were not even answers in the choices I could select. I emailed, I called in, and explained my dilemma and how terribly wrong things had gone for me in the years since. No one ever followed up. Our outcome doesn't suit their narrative. Another woman said she was never sent a survey a year after her Hope Restored Marriage Intensive. She said, "Oh, we didn't even make it 4 months out. About 8 months after the intensive, I asked them to remove me from the email list as my husband and I had separated, and I was too heartbroken to keep seeing their tips on how to communicate or date or super basic things that don't help in any emergency room situation like we were in." So if Hope Restored doesn't send out surveys to all participants, and if they don't offer open-ended questions or the option for negative answers, then it appears their post-intensive divorce stats could be far higher than they admit. Now, I wrote to Hope Restored using the email on the website, and here's the reply I got. Short version: thanks for your questions. Sorry we are unable to give you the evidence for our claims. And while we're at it, here are some more claims that we also won't give any evidence for. I've put a link in the show notes so you can read this for yourself. So you get where I'm going with this? This whole Hope Restored miracle claim is kind of questionable. The idea that they have a proven intensive model seems to be unsubstantiated also. I Googled it and didn't find any academic research that had compared it to any other curriculum. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you dig into the Hope Restored website, you'll find that they suggest you go elsewhere if you have domestic violence, emotional abuse, physical or emotional affairs, or substance addiction in your marriage. You have to wonder why they put that statement way down there and not on the homepage. Did the Focus on the Family lawyers insist on it so they won't be sued for malpractice or censured for ethics violations? Did the staff put it on there just to be honest with people up front before they paid? Because just a few minutes ago, you heard the story of a couple who took time off of work, spent thousands of dollars, traveled all the way to Michigan, only to find out on the very first day that infidelity is on their list of issues they can't fix. This seems a lot like the Ocean Gate disaster, where the CEO made big, loud, confident claims about the submersible's safety, even though the experts disagreed. People paid $250,000 to take this submersible down to the Titanic wreck. The vehicle imploded and all 5 people were killed. And just to remind you, an abuser can lock their family in a room, restrain them with chains, beat the children, put a gun to their spouse's head, and Focus on the Family still does not condone divorce. They might tell you to leave, to get to safety, or to go, but they don't mean divorce. If you read their policy closely, they tell the victim to adopt a zero tolerance policy toward abuse. But these words are meaningless when it comes to a chronic abuser. It's a toothless threat coming from an organization that categorically opposes divorce for abuse. Not only that, they also excuse abusers, blame wives for husbands' marriage-endangering sin, and give the impression that divorce is worse for kids than abuse, which 30 years of family research shows is not true. So if you wish to attend, that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you not to go. If you want to go and say you did everything you could to save your marriage, then by all means do it. If you want to give it one last chance to placate your pastor or your parents, go for it. Just go with your eyes open and know that every time you share about a fear or a vulnerability in front of an opportunistic spouse, they are likely to use it against you. A spouse with a pattern of being mean might pretend to be empathetic and supportive in front of an audience, but the new information about your fears that they glean will likely be used to control you in the future. One woman who found peace by getting a divorce said, "Much of the trauma that I seek healing from is from the misplaced trust that I put in these professionals who shared my faith and sought to save the marriage and keep my family together at all costs." Wow, that's pretty loud and clear. Now, some of you are going to push back. You're going to say, "Gretchen, I've gone to the Hope Restored website and they have a lot of testimonials on it." Well, that's because on the final day of the program, the staff requests feedback from the participants and then later conducts longer surveys. However, you'll notice that the testimonies hardly mention transforming an abusive or unfaithful marriage into a healthy one. Instead, they're very vague, or many testimonies resemble individuals who've just completed a Christian high school summer camp. They're brimming with enthusiasm to apply the new communication tools they've learned. But communication tools don't work if one person feels entitled to take advantage of the other. I think there's another interesting fact to bring up, and that's that Hope Restored brings in a lot of money for Focus on the Family. Focus on the Family's public tax records show that the year they acquired this program, they brought in $2.5 million from their marriage enrichment programs. Now, nearly 10 years later, with more locations open in the United States, plus new locations in Canada, who knows just how much they bring in. In the past 18 months, they've increased their counseling staff listed on their public website by nearly 30% between February 2022 and June 2023. Who knows how many people they will lure in with their miracle claims? It's a lot of money, and there are a lot of frightened wives out there willing to pay that. Hope Restored enlists the services of an advertising agency to disseminate millions of messages through direct mail and their extensive email list, comprising more than 1 million names. To grasp the scale of their advertising endeavors, in just 1 year alone, they paid Ambassador Advertising Agency more than $10 million for their services. But that's nothing compared to their income. Their website says they've helped more than 7,000 couples in the past 20 years. At $5,000 per couple, and I know that number isn't right because it's changed over the years, that would be about $35 million. Now, Focus on the Family has asked the IRS to reclassify them from being a nonprofit to being a church. Now, another way you may push back at me is to say, well, wait a second. Okay, so what if the person has been an abuser or a cheater in the past? They showed up at the program, they paid the money. Isn't this evidence that they've changed? Well, not necessarily. Abusers and cheaters are pretty clever. They know that Focus on the Family insists on forgiveness and reconciliation over and over. They know that the wife is trapped, and the abusive husband counts on Focus on the Family to side with him, minimizing his behavior by suggesting that he just had unmet needs. That's why they're not afraid to go to Hope Restored marriage intensives. Husbands with a pattern of chronic abuse or cheating are confident that the counselors there will put pressure on the wife not to divorce. In contrast to the pressure they put on the wives, the counselors give husbands lots of praise, pats on the back, and loving support for acknowledging their difficulties in life. Another thing that abusers can count on is that Hope Restored will say things that lead wives to believe that divorce universally destroys kids or will create a legacy of divorce, which it doesn't. Since the 1990s, researchers have shown that 8 in 10 kids of divorce turn out fine with no long-term serious psychological, emotional, or social problems. And children whose parents divorce for very serious reasons still hold marriage in high regard and are likely to have lifelong marriages themselves. I'll give you links to that claim in the show notes. Here's the third first-person story. And again, the woman wishes to be anonymous. She wants you to know that if there's abuse in your marriage, focus on the family will not be your answer. She feels she wasted $4,000, but she also heard from a Hope Restored therapist that her husband wasn't a safe person. It isn't what she wanted to hear, but at least the counselor was honest, and an honest assessment from a therapist about the reality of the situation can be the turning point an individual needs. Here's her quote. The counselors focused only on communicating the ministry's marriage model and learning communication skills, nothing else. Childhood abuse from parents, porn use, psychological or emotional abuse appeared avoided, even though attendees cried as they shared the impact of these events on their individual lives. I asked the head counselor, how can I apply what you're teaching to my situation? His answer was, I can't help you. He is not a safe person for you. There you have it. $4,000 later, and I hear, he is not safe for you. I cannot help you. That is the overall summary of their advice to me during that week. I went to focus on the family for help, but in turn, I received a heavier load than I carried before. Anyone who studies narcissism at any depth quickly learns that narcissists do not see themselves as victims, but as superiors. My husband has openly admitted to this, but after being sympathized with as the helpless victim, he grew stauncher and more arrogant in his resistance to me and to the health in our marriage. If the counselors had had any heart or even any serious training on these issues, then maybe the story could have been different. But in light of my experience, if there's abuse in your marriage, focus on the family will not be your answer. And Hope Restored agrees. If you're dealing with abuse, adultery, or addictions, they recommend you find help elsewhere. If you benefited from this recording, you will find support and clarity in my book, The Life-Saving Divorce, available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon. You can also follow me, Gretchen Baskerville, online at lifesavingdivorce.com or on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram. You can sign up for my email list at lifesavingdivorce.com. Women and men of faith may request to join my private online Facebook group, Life Saving Divorce Private Group. For more on life-saving divorces, please subscribe and click the link to the next recording.